Hello and welcome back to the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. My name is Clay Wright. It's great to be here with you all, and I'm here once again with Pastor Jim Mindling.
It's good to be here.
It's good to be with you, Jim.
Yeah.
How are you doing today?
I'm well, yes.
Good.
Someone asked me that question earlier today, and for some reason I said, I'm hydrated. As soon as I said it, I thought, why did I say that?
That's actually the first question I will ask my wife if she tells me, oh man, I'm not feeling well. I kind of have a headache. I'll be like, oh, well, have you been drinking water? And she teases me about that now because apparently there's like these Reddit threads or something where men will ask their wives this question. Does this ever happen to you, between you and Andrea?
Occasionally, but it's not all happen a lot. No.
I think
But she asks me, have you been drinking enough water?
Really?
Yeah.
That's a rabbit trail in and of itself, but that's hilarious, first of all. But I'm excited to have this conversation today, hydrated or not,
Well, since we are talking about water.
We are talking about, that's a great transition.
And the Greek word for water is hydro. So
that's true. But
Hydra.
We'll be continuing our study of the book of Luke. This is what we're preaching through at Open Door right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this time, we're going to, in case this is your first time joining us on the cutting room floor,
Welcome.
What we do is we go back to the text that we preached through on Sunday, and we pick up the pieces that get left out because there's so much depth to the Word of God. And so we just finished up this excursion that's all about getting into the Word, taking a next step with the Word.
Right.
And now this past Sunday, we begin a new sermon series in Luke chapter 8, looking at fear and how we should fear not,
Right.
specifically. And so we looked at a very famous passage, one that I think you've probably taught on before, but I don't know that for certain. Have you taught on this passage before?
Actually, I've taught on this passage in Israel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when I take people to Israel, I think every time we've gone on a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee, and I think we have each time. So depending upon the driver of the boat, because some drivers are like they want to go out and then come back, but I always ask them, hey, could I just talk a couple minutes? And so they're most of the time pretty gracious. So I have spoken on the Sea of Galilee, so cool, on this passage.
Wow.
And it's pretty cool, but I've never had a storm come up while we were in the boat. But as I mentioned in the sermon, one time we were in the area and a storm blew up and we had already gone on the boat and it happened quickly. And I'm like, yes, this, because I've been to Israel so many times and it's never happened. I thought to myself, how often do these storms, happen?
Sure.
Because every time we go, we are usually in the Sea of Galilee area 2.5 days.
Okay.
So that's 2.5 days out of the whole year.
Sure.
So sure, it's very easy to imagine that storms didn't come up. But after I was done preaching, one of the people that went with me,
Rebecca
Forsyth, she had reminded me, I was with you the time that storm came up, and I reminded her, did you remember? And I didn't say this in the sermon, so I guess it's left on the cutting room floor. But the storm was so bad that as we drove south away from the Sea of Galilee, where we were on the southern part of the Sea of Galilee, vicious storm clouds, winds, a tree fell over onto a car, and we were like 3 cars behind. So because we're in the bus, we're up, and we can see the tree on the car. And so it blocked the traffic, and we're just sitting there, and then the driver backed up and went a different direction. And we found out later that somebody died in that.
Oh, my gosh.
That's how vicious the winds were.
Wow.
And we didn't see the tree fall, but it had just happened freshly, and we were like the third or fourth, fifth vehicle. And it was like a real sobering reminder of how powerful and how dangerous these sudden storms that come up on the Sea of Galilee, how dangerous they are.
Because and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I'm remembering my time in Israel, they taught us that Israel is a very arid place. It's not necessarily, it doesn't get rain all the time. There's lots of desert areas. But then when it does rain, because of the way that the soil is and the topography, you can get all these monsoons or all these like mudslides, basically.
Yeah.
So like when it rains, it pours. Kind of
Exactly.
was the impression I got.
Yeah, that's especially the case in the southern parts around the Dead Sea and the wilderness.
Yeah.
These flash floods come because the ground is so hard from the sun baking on it, and there's no moisture. So it's almost. I was in Arizona recently. It's almost like the monsoons that happened there. Same thing. The ground is almost like a parking lot. It's just so hard and so flat, the water hits it and just roars.
Yeah.
Instead of soaking in, it just like a parking lot just roars. So, and as it comes down the mountains, it picks up speed. And, you know, when we go to the southern parts of Israel, we have been warned, you know, before we got there, if you see any clouds, change your plans immediately. Do not be those people that say, "Oh, I want to go get close to where the wadis is what they're called are happening, so I can see what it's like." Because you can get caught up in a flash flood in seconds and washed away. And then they tell you stories about people that did. So the southern part of Israel is the most arid by far. And for a long time, the Israelites have learned to do irrigation. And so the northern part of Israel is much more, it's almost like the Caribbean. It's very lush and very beautiful. Yeah. And so you don't have that, and you just don't have that kind of packed desert, dry feel like you do for the southern part.
That's true. Yeah.
So you never hear about those kinds of things happening in the Galilee.
Sure. Yeah, I suppose that's true. But is the rain just as
sudden?
Yeah, or does it like my impression was in the winter is more their rainy season.
Definitely.
But if it's not in the winter, you probably won't see any rain. Is that the same up in the Galilee?
It is.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So that's why the irrigation is so important, because
that makes sense.
But there's, because of the kind of the ground, the soil content, and wells and water table and things like that, it's just not as dry and arid as down south.
Yeah.
So basically, May to first week or two of November never rains. So more than likely, you know, we now know this episode probably happened sometime between November and April. You know, it's not, we can't prove that, but you know, when you look at the weather patterns year after year after year, and it never rains. And you can read about this in the Old Testament. They talk about the latter rains, and they talk about the autumn rains, and and how, I remember one time this was the second week in November, was the latest time we've ever gone to Israel, and it starts to pour. And I don't mean just like, it's pouring, and we're in Jerusalem.
Oh no.
And we're like running for stores. We're out in the streets. We're running for stores, running for, cover. Just the opposite is what the Israelis are doing. They're running out into the streets, like, and they got their hands up and their faces up. It's the first rain of the year, and they're just dancing. And I'm just like, look at us. We're hiding, and they're out in it because it never rains.
Yeah.
It was such a stark reminder of those passages in the Scripture where they celebrated the rain because now we have crops, and now we can get rid of the famine. And so,
studying, in my view, one of the greatest parts about going to Israel is getting these geographical, topographical, climate kinds of insights.
Yeah, definitely.
When I was on the Sea of Galilee, our boat broke down in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and we had to get towed back.
Which is cool because you got to spend more time.
Yes, so it was. We were going from about midway on the eastern shore. And we were going northwest, and they were going to drop us off, if I remember correctly, but we never made it.
So you were going to Capernaum, probably.
Yeah, I think so. And our resort was on that eastern bank.
Okay.
Which,
all right.
Anyhow, we digress a little bit, but not too much. This is what the cutting room floor is partly for.
Well, can I just say this? That's fascinating because that's where we accessed the lake on the eastern side at a resort in order when it was storming. Because we had already gone on the Sea of Galilee, and we were supposed to go someplace else, and it started to whip up. And I said to the bus driver, I think Brian Patrick was on that trip.
Oh, yeah.
He was. And the storm whipped up, and I said, take us to the shore. And he's like, well, we don't have time to get there and go here. I'm like, this is more important. And so on the east side, about
Yes.
halfway down, there's a resort, and we never stayed there, so I don't know what the name of it is, but that's the access we had, and he took us right down to the shore, and we're standing there with the wind just whipping, and see the whitecaps get bigger and bigger, and now they're stacking, and
Yeah.
it's like, this is it. This is what Jesus was talking about.
That probably was the same. Maybe there's multiple resorts, but that's right where we stayed.
Yeah, there's not a lot of resorts on the east side.
And that was the nicest place we stayed.
Yeah.
Our whole time in Israel. It was I was engaged at the time. I just proposed, and I was like, we're coming back to this resort for our honeymoon and all that kind of stuff. That never
But
happened.
you didn't.
But
Yeah.
maybe one of these
Was it En
days.
Gev by chance?
It might have been.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, there's only, I think, one or two on the east side. Then when you get down to the south, there's about 4 or 5 of them down there. But most of the hotels, resorts, and lodging places are around Tiberias and on the western side.
yeah. Ein Gev, it's the EINGEV. I
Yep.
think that might have been it.
Probably was.
So
yeah.
if you're ever looking to honeymoon in Israel, on the Sea of Galilee, but not during the rainy season, I guess is what we're saying. But that betrays this passage that we're looking at this week, which is the calming of the storm. And one of Jesus's, I don't know. I mean, Jesus has a lot of famous miracles.
This is a pretty big one.
Yeah. The wind and the seas obey him.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful passage. And we're studying this, and as you helped us to see, we're learning about how we can respond to frightening situations, with, partly with faith.
Yeah.
And, how do we respond well to these things?
Right.
And you begged this question, what does faith look like? Which I loved.
Yeah.
What did Jesus want them to do?
Right.
And as you were sort of begging that question and framing the sermon, you gave a few things that you some suggestions. You said, hey, did Jesus want them to rebuke the storm themselves?
Right.
Did Jesus want them to
Hold
hug the
on.
mast and
Right.
hold on tight?
Uh-huh.
And you said, well, maybe, but why don't we look and maybe we can discover from the text? And then you walked us through, which was fantastic. But before we get deeper into that, I want to ask, I think for, as far as I'm concerned, me, myself, and maybe some other people felt the same way, I was like, yeah, is there ever a time where we should like rebuke the wind and the waves? That's a popular teaching, that sort of this name it, claim it type of stuff.
Yeah.
And there are some texts where it seems to indicate, yeah, like the book of Acts, if we're following the example of the apostles, there are times where they certainly seem to be proclaiming or declaring things and healing people, that sort of stuff.
Right.
So, I can see how in this situation that wasn't what faith ought to have looked like. But is that never the case, or why isn't that the case? Can you talk more about those two other responses?
Well, I was trying to be careful not to say, let me make it positive. I was trying to be careful to say that I'm not sure. I don't think that's what Jesus was looking for. So I'm giving some opinion.
Okay.
I'm giving some interpretation.
Yeah.
Because there isn't anything in the text that indicates that Jesus did or did not want them to rebuke the wind and the waves. There's not anything in the text that indicates whether he did or did not want them to just hold on. So I scoured the text for some sort of clue as to what exactly Jesus wanted. And so you could argue with my interpretation and say, Jim, I disagree with you. And then I would love to have that conversation. I certainly don't feel like this is the only way to interpret this text.
Sure.
But as I walk with God, and as I get rebuked by Jesus, Jim, where is your faith? And as I listen to other people's stories, and as I read the Bible, I see over and over these very human responses that when I'm in my area of strength, I tend to wait to the very last second to ask God for help. And that's exactly what this text shows us. And so it's not, it's not surprising to me that Jesus were to say, where is your faith? Because, he didn't see any evidence of it. You know, what he saw was, well, he saw evidence of faith, but faith in themselves.
Yeah.
And then, then when I remember getting the insight, well, hey, wait a minute, this is where the loudest disciples are Peter, James, and John. We hear more from them than anybody else. They're the first 4 disciples. We hear a little bit about Andrew, but we don't hear hardly anything else from the rest of the disciples. So, you know, these are the most vocal. And, you know, it's hard to believe that these disciples that are whining and stuff are the disciples that never speak. You don't have a case here of Bartholomew or Nathaniel who've never been on the water freaking out, and Peter and James and John going, guys, you know, trust, we're fine. It's the disciples. It's all of them.
Yeah.
So maybe Nathaniel and Matthew and others who weren't used to being in the boat, when they saw Peter and James and John freaking out, they're like, we are really in trouble because they know they've been on the boats, you know.
There was when we were on Lake, you hinted at a story when you were on either Lake Erie or another lake. I have a similar story on Lake Erie. Our maiden voyage of a new boat that my parents had bought.
Oh no!
And we're coming. We put in and went west over to Vermilion and ate Buffalo Wild Wings, Quaker Steak and Lube.
Yeah.
I don't remember where we went, but we had gone west. And then when we were coming back east, the wind was blowing in our face, and the waves were coming up into the front of the boat. And we're laughing, cracking up. It's 4th of July weekend. We thought it was the funniest thing. And then all of a sudden, my dad slowed down the boat because someone was working with their contacts, trying to get a contact out. And the nose of the boat went down, and we took on a huge wave. And then another one. And what reminded me is you're saying when they saw Peter freaking out, then they freaked out. We all turn around and see my dad, who is like a very calm, collected, like strong guy. And he's just like this blank look on his face. So we're like, oh, this is bad. Like,
if Dad's concerned, we ought to be terrified.
All the life jackets are floating away. The whole boat's flooded. It's a cool story. My dad actually says to this day, he said he in that moment he prayed and he heard God say, like in his mind, the word bail. And so we started bailing water. The boat ended up being fine. We got it back up, drove it back in. So it was a cool outcome. But we were like, this is it. Yeah. We're going down.
Yeah. And you wouldn't have been the first. Lake Erie is littered with boats that went down.
Yes.
I've got 2 stories that about that. My first one is the first time I was in a boat on Lake Erie. And the guy named Mark Thompson, a doctor in our church, taken me and another staff member out. And I don't want to give the name of this staff member because he flipped out. But we were doing this. We were going up and going down. And it was a little bit frightening, but I also just kind of loved it. Now, I don't like roller coasters.
Sure.
But I loved being on a boat in Lake Erie going like this. I'm holding on, the back, and I'm kind of like screaming, yeah. And I turn around, and this staff member is like white. And he's freaking, he's like, I don't know, ready to throw up. And he's like, fearing, get me out of here, I would have loved to have told that story. But it's. I heard lots of stories that Lake Erie, the storms happen fast because, like Sea of Galilee, it's shallow.
Yeah.
And so when the wind can whip up and in a shallow lake, it can cause storms. But the problem with Sea of Galilee is because it's such a small lake, and because the mountains are so high around it, it creates a cauldron feel. And especially on the east side, the Golan Heights can get pretty high. And there's that funneling effect I talked about. It's just like it's created, for a perfect storm, you might say. And that's why it can happen so fast and be so vicious.
Well, and on that note, there's another question I wanted to ask. Is there anything you wanted to wrap up in that last point?
I forgot. I actually forgot where we were going.
we were talking about rebuking.
Oh yeah.
Or holding to the mast.
Yeah. So I didn't see any indications in the text that Jesus did or did not give a prescription of this is what faith looks like. So I built it by comparing the Gospel of Mark with the Gospel of Luke, and noticing these things. And as I was praying about this and just listening to God, and these kind of things came to my mind. And so I believe the Holy Spirit led me, but I can't prove, and nor would I ever argue, this is the interpretation. This is what Jesus was absolutely looking like. So that's why I used in the sermon language like, I think Jesus was, or I think they were. And I think what Jesus was looking for was, this idea of looking to him quickly, immediately. And that's a very biblical concept. And so between the biblical concept of not going in and out with our relationship with God, we don't trust God when we're only in the storms. We walk with him moment by moment. So when things are calm, we're walking with God. When things are confusing, we're walking with God. When things are scary, we're walking with God. And this is the picture that's painted in the Bible as those who are faithful. And so based upon that, it looked to me like the disciples were not trusting God. They were not trusting Jesus. They were freaking out. And so, I think they should have woken Jesus earlier. Or I also think when they woke him up, they could have, if they had been more calm, that would have been what faith looks like. Hey, Jesus, we got a storm coming up. Is there something we need to do? Versus, and I think that why I say they waited to the very last second is because they were worked up into this emotional lather.
Yeah, they were despairing.
Oh, and
it's Jesus, it's over. It's done. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that kind of thing couldn't have happened with seasoned boaters, but fishermen. Immediately. That took some time, and the feeling of it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Oh my gosh, we're going down. The boat is swamped, and that's when they lost control of their mind. They lost control of their emotions, and they're now blaming. Mark has them blaming Jesus, and don't you care if we drown? And so it gets into point too, but. If Jesus had finished the episode by saying something like, these storms only come out or only get calmed down by prayer, like he did the time he cast the demon out of the child, some additional teaching. This is where you guys failed. Then we can be more clear about this is what he was looking for. But since we know faith, the picture of faith is walking with God consistently, not up and down, not in and out. That's what they were not doing. That's my reasoning for why I think Jesus was saying faith looks like walking with me consistently, persistently, immediately, instead of treating me like some kind of genie or, magical savior who comes in and swoops in at the last second. What God wants from us is relationship. What he wants is living surrendered. What he wants is walking by faith, not by sight. So those are the kinds of, this biblical knowledge that informed how I interpreted the text.
Yeah, and I think that's so. I resonate with that personally, and I struggle with this personally, and I this whole idea of independence and the indications of independence that you pulled out of the text. I thought that was awesome. That whole list, and I found myself going, yep. We have this prideful, self-centered. Well, really, we just don't think about it. It's sort of just we intuitively feel as though, well, I don't need Jesus to start my car.
Yeah.
This morning I woke up. This was the first morning that I've had to scrape my windshield.
Same here.
Of the frost.
Same here.
And I'm like, I wasn't thinking, oh Jesus, help me to get this frost off of my car. So, speak to that a little bit. What does that look like when we're not feeling the need? What does that relying on Jesus mean? Yeah,
it means practicing the presence of God. So I'm just walking with him, and so this is what I do. I just talk with him. Some people might think I'm talking to myself, but I'm talking to God. So I get out in the driveway. I'm like, we got some frost today, Lord. It's just I'm just having a conversation with him throughout the day. So it feels very natural for me to say, well, right now I'm feeling some fear or some anxiety because I've been talking to him about things where I don't feel anxiety, I don't feel fear. I especially am dialed into talking to God when I'm in nature. I am constantly saying, "Oh, your creation here, that's way to go. That's beautiful." And I'm praising God for the fall colors. I was in Elyria Cascade Park. What's today? Today's Wednesday. I was there Monday, and around my house, most of the leaves have fallen down, and the trees are starting to look bare. And we've lost all the color. I got into Cascade Park just 2 days ago, and there's still a ton of trees. I don't know if you've been there recently.
I've not.
Things can change in the fall quickly. But
Right.
there was all this color, which means they're probably oak trees, because oak trees are usually the last trees to lose their leaves.
Huh.
And so I have elm and hickory, which are some of the earliest ones to learn, and maples, some maples. But oaks are usually the last. And so I'm guessing that a lot of those trees were oaks. But there's just a splash of color, and I'm like, oh God, that is beautiful, And I'm just talking to him and praising him, thanking him, because he did it. He created trees to have this sap in them that when cold happens, they change colors. And what a great idea!
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
I totally agree. I think that one of the great deceptions of the enemy is that you don't need God. You just don't. You could live your life. And I think, I remember you preached a sermon, it might have been on John 15.
Abiding in the vine?
Yeah, about this idea of apart from me, you can do nothing. I don't know if you were preaching on that text or just quoting it elsewhere, but you said, what does this mean? Apart from me, you can do nothing. Because it seems as though I could go play the lottery, I could go do all sorts of things. What is meant here? But it just such a powerful truth. At any given time, even if there's not a pressing need, there's this deep need that we have where deep calls to deep. We need
That's good.
Jesus. He's the greatest need of every human being at every point in time.
Yeah.
And I think it's the scheme of the enemy to try to convince us otherwise.
Well, I usually say about that passage in John 15, you can do a lot of things without him, but nothing of significance. And if we're going to think about kingdom, nothing of kingdom value. So yeah, I can scrape the car without. I didn't need God to scrape the car, but I am thankful that I have two arms. I didn't say this. I'm just vocalizing right now.
Yeah.
But I'm thankful that I have two arms and that I can do that. But there's a ton of things I can do without him, but nothing of value, nothing of significance, and certainly nothing that's going to impact somebody for the kingdom and for life.
I've found that one of the most important things that I can do personally as I'm walking with Jesus is to intentionally remind myself of the depth of my need.
That's good.
And there's lots of different ways to do that.
Yeah.
Like fasting is one way that I've experimented with. I don't do it all the time, but when I have done it, it is an effective reminder of my
that's what it's supposed to do.
Need.
Yeah.
And
that's what it's designed to do.
There's other ways of doing it as well, but I want to use this to segue into another question that I think is going to be along similar lines, which is, you pointed out that you believe that Jesus is not surprised by this storm that whips up. He's bringing his disciples into the storm as I don't know if you use this, but as a discipleship excursion.
Definitely. I didn't. Yeah, I didn't say.
You didn't use that language, but
I wish I would have. I like that.
It's this.
That's a great phrase. How come you didn't tell me that earlier? That's awesome.
I was actually working on my sermon earlier today, and I'm like, oh, write that down. Because the excursion continues this upcoming week. But I totally agree. Jesus in his omniscience, especially these bookends from Luke 8:1 and Luke 9:2 of Jesus is clearly in this portion training his disciples. That's the focus.
Yes.
And so, but it raises questions. What are you mean to say, Jim, that Jesus is going to bring me into storms in my life?
Yes.
Well, that doesn't seem very kind or loving.
Yeah, let me say two things about that. The first thing is I just remembered something I left on the cutting room floor.
Okay.
And that was that I used to believe that Jesus was just kind of a wandering itinerant rabbi. That's for a long time I believed that. And then there's a passage later on in Luke where it says that Jesus set his face like flint. Is the idea, like, he intentionally set his face to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die there. And then I began to notice like passages that are coming up in Luke soon where Jesus takes the disciples inside and says, we're going to Jerusalem. Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. He's going to die, and then on the third day he's going to be raised. How does Jesus know that? Well, he's omniscient. But he's not only knows it, he says, and that's why we're going. There's an intentionality. There is a strategicness about Jesus. And once I saw that, it's like my eyes were open to all kinds of strategic moments in the life of Jesus. And it completely flipped my understanding of Jesus. And I don't know if this was because the time I discovered this, I was growing as a leader, and kind of wrestling with, what does it mean for me to lead? I was growing so much, and I want to lead like Jesus. Well, how did Jesus lead? And I thought that he just kind of floated around and just took advantage of the moment. Hey, there's flowers. Let me talk about flowers. And I do believe that he took advantage of the moments that were there, but I also came to not just believe, but to see the absolute certainty of Jesus being a very strategic person. And once I began to see that all over the Gospels, it began to influence how I interpreted texts like this. When Jesus says, hey guys, let's go to the other side, I'm asking the question, is that one of those strategic moments? Is that one of those intentional moments?
Yeah.
And I'm going to save, so you're going to tell us something this Sunday that it's going to prove, I think it's going to prove to us that there was intentionality and what Jesus was doing, and maybe multiple intentions.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to give that away.
I know.
I'll save it for you.
Thank you.
But I just began to see all this intentionality. So I can't prove it, but if Jesus had, if somebody else had said, hey, let's go to the other side, that changes everything for me. That doesn't mean Jesus can't still use this intentional moment.
Yeah.
But when he says, let's go, follow me, we're going over there, now my ears are tweaked.
Yeah.
My ears are tweaked. Yeah, my ears are tweaked, and my eyes get open to go, okay, if he's telling them to come, then what's he got in mind? And since he's omniscient, what's he gonna do? So,
and especially like in that context of he's getting ready to send out his disciples to do these things.
That's right. We're in a season of training.
And so, I thought that was really, really helpful. I want to ask another question.
Well, there's one I haven't answered yet.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, I can answer that one too, but
yeah,
you had two. I said there was two ways I wanted to answer that. Two things.
Yes.
And so the second thing is more directly to your question, which was, how do we know?
It was. Does this mean that Jesus is going to lead me into storms in life?
Right.
That doesn't feel very loving.
Yes. It is absolutely loving because since he is intentional, the larger intention, the larger purpose is to shape and form. Spiritual formation is always happening. And so Jesus is intentionally shaping us and bringing us into relationships, bringing us into situations, bringing us into opportunities to trust him, to learn, to grow. And this is one of the biggest insights into discipleship, that every moment with Jesus is a teaching moment. Every moment is a spiritual formation moment. Every now. I learned this from John Ortberg. In his book, God is Closer Than You Think. He talked a lot about the now and how we want to be attentive. Leighton Ford taught me that word, attentive. And if you spend much time with me, you hear me say and pray all the time, let's be attentive to that. Lord, make me attentive, or I'll pray for you. Lord, help Clay to be attentive. Leighton Ford is the guy who taught me that word. But John Ortberg is the one who taught me that we want to be attentive specifically to the spiritual formation that can happen in this moment if my ears are open, and if my eyes are open, and if I'm attentive, And everything just opens up for discipleship when you have that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
So that's what you're doing when you're following to learn. You're not just following, but you're following to learn. Then you realize that with Jesus, he's so strategic. Every moment is a teaching moment. What do you want to teach me now? And that shapes how I pray. Instead of whining and praying, why did you let this happen? I started asking, what are you doing? You know, help me to get in on it. Help me to see what you're doing. And so sometimes I don't know whether he led me into this and that's his intention, or he is intentionally using the circumstances that I'm in. And I don't need to know, because I trust his sovereign love, and whether he's intentionally doing or allowing it.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with both, because everything God allows, he redeems.
That's right.
Everything he allows, he uses for his purposes. So I don't need, not anymore, I used to, but I don't need to know whether he sent that or whether he allowed it. And that's a big crossroads for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I want to ask people, if you are trusting God, what difference does it make? Whether he sent it or whether he allowed it? Really?
Yeah.
What difference does that make? Do you find it easier to trust God if he sent it? Or do you find it easier to trust God if you allowed it? Oh, I don't know why. I don't, because he's sovereign. One way or the other, God's involved. And so I want to be listening and attentive.
Yeah. My mind is going in 100 directions, because I'm like, first of all, yes. And, even what the enemy means for evil, right? I mean, this is the story of Joseph.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, I think it's the story. There's the story of Job speaks to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm also just praising God. I was just having a conversation last night with a friend who is experiencing a difficult situation with hospitalizations and things like that. And they're like, "Hey, yeah, this was terrible, and of course, I wouldn't have wanted this to happen, but look what God has done." And seeing this, hey, we found out about this, and we were able to have that conversation, and our family came together. All these things that happened where it's like, yeah, it may be the case that God brought this, but it may also be the case that even what the enemy means for evil, he turns it for good.
That's the test of sovereignty.
And so it's just a beautiful reminder that nothing comes our way that God won't use to make us more like Jesus, and that he won't use to get his glory.
And believe it or not, in a loving way. So some people can't, they have a hard time making it fit that God is loving and he allows pain, or he sends pain. I was talking to a guy in our church just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. He was experiencing some pain, and he was like, "Man, this is intense." And finally, his wife, and they convinced each other that he needed to go to the ER to deal with this pain. They got to the ER and started doing the tests, and they discovered something else that was life-threatening. You know who this guy is. He's one of your teachers in your marriage class. He found out this life-threatening disease or situation that would have been a silent killer. He would never have discovered it. And he understands now. I thank God for the pain that sent me to the ER so they could discover this life-threatening issue.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of how this guy, his attentiveness and his willingness to be led by God and believing that God was at work in his life, caused him to see God's hand at work.
Right.
In the pain.
Yes.
So yeah.
And I think, there's two things I want to say here. One thing is, I'm not masochistic in the sense that, when we're talking about debilitating physical suffering or something like that. Now, I do think that God, what we just said is still true for those situations, but, that can be, I don't want to gloss over the challenge that some believers face with chronic pain and these sorts of things.
2 Corinthians 9, Paul's thorn in the flesh. I asked you 3 times to take it away. And
yes.
3 times, and he didn't. So he began to, okay, I guess that means that God is using this to teach me what? Dependence, trust. My grace is sufficient for you.
And that's what that was the compliment to that. That notwithstanding, I'm always encouraged when I look back at my life And when I consider the times when I feel that I've grown the most, or when I felt the nearest to God, oftentimes those are not the times when everything was going well. As a matter of fact, I find it most difficult to follow Jesus on vacation. Like when I'm out at a resort, when I'm out, I just I'm like,
you don't feel the need.
What does it mean here?
Yeah.
You know, what is it? And it's that's something I personally wrestle with. But and so back to my earlier thing, you know, fasting is sort of a self-imposed storm.
Oh, good.
But you know, at times God he's a better caretaker than us, and so He will impose these sorts of things on us to deepen our dependence.
Yeah.
And
or lovingly lead us into it.
Yes, yeah. and I have come to thank God for those times, you know, when I was deeply, you know, depressed or so frustrated, dealing with so much shame. Of course, I would never wish that upon myself or anyone, but it certainly was effective when it comes to teaching me the love of God, teaching me that God is pursuing me even when I can't sense it or even when I don't see it.
Yeah.
It's in those fires that those deep truths were forged.
That's right.
And so I
definitely,
when we pray for a deep into dependence, Jesus may say, "All right, let's go to the other side.
Jump in.
You know,
let's go."
So I just think it's a great reminder for us.
Yeah.
I think a last question I might ask. Oh man, there was one the question that we passed over, which I don't know that we've got time to deal with. It is, well, maybe it could be a quick answer. I don't know. When we talk about the intentionality of Jesus, was he relying on the leading of the Spirit, or was he relying on his omniscience as God?
Yeah.
And does it matter? Did Jesus get increasing clarity as time went on? Those are some questions that can come up when we talk about the omniscience or the intentionality of Jesus, because people will be like, well, wait, then why is he asking a question? And it raises some interesting conversations.
So I'll give a real knee-jerk answer. I think this gives us a beautiful insight into the Trinity. I also think that Jesus was led by the Spirit, according to Luke 4 and 14 and 16, in a moment by moment. So and how is he led by the Spirit? Well, you know, the Spirit told me to go there. No, I think it's this relationship we talked about. The Trinity has a constant relationship that's other-centered and it's so loving. It's not need-based. It's relationship-based. It's you know, it's just that. It's relationship-based. So many times our relationships are need-based. Clay, I need this. Will you get this from me? Will you meet me here? You know, so it's just a need-based relationship. But that's not what's happening in the Trinity. It's relationship. So I'm talking to you because I love you. And so Jesus is in conversation with the Spirit, and that's how the Spirit's leading him. And where does that leadership and his omniscience begin and end? It doesn't. They all flow together. And so, you know, this brings us to the whole kenosis passage in Philippians 2. How much of Jesus did he, you know, was he emptied of? And that's a very long discussion, so we won't go there.
Yeah.
But I think we can do a quick answer that this gives us insight into this leadership, this relationship. And I want to be more Trinitarian. I want to be more relational instead of more need-based in my walk with God.
I totally agree.
Watching Jesus.
Yeah, and that even speaks to earlier how I absolutely believe that our greatest need is Christ at any given moment, but what a deeper sense of relationship you can have when you say, it's not that I need you, Lord. Yeah. It's that I want you. I want to be with you.
Let's do life together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to wrap up this conversation by asking you a question about this second point.
Okay.
The point 2 in the outline was that faith looks like trusting God even when we feel fear. And I wondered, we've got a few minutes left, what would you say to a person who's listening to your sermon and they're saying, you know, Jim, that's great, but you just don't understand the paralyzing prospect that I'm facing. Yeah. I'm terrified of sharing my faith in school. I'm terrified of this diagnosis. I'm terrified of, you know, doing what I feel God has called me to do. How can I just trust God when the fear feels so tight and so close?
So good. And so when I have been asked that many times, and my pastoral response is, you're right. I don't know exactly what you're feeling. I don't try to say, well, I've had this experience that was really terrifying. When a person says stuff like that, I never try to help them try to understand that. I've experienced lots of fear too, I say, no, I don't know. But God does, and that's not a Sunday school answer. God knows, and he's with you in this. And that's, to me, the beauty of the closing song. Give me faith. Ask God for faith. And I just love the response of the Father, of the human Father, in the story where Jesus says, if you just believe, that he will be healed or something. And the father of the boy says, I believe.
Help me in my unbelief.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Because that's me. I do love you, God, and I believe you. But I also think I've identified that I'm flagging a little bit in my faith, and I'm not sure I have enough faith for this. So help me. I believe, but help me fill in the gaps where I'm, give me faith to trust what you say. I love that line. And God gives faith. In James, he says, God gives wisdom if we just ask. And we know from Ephesians 2 that God gives faith. So ask him for it, and that's what that Father's asking Jesus. I believe, help me. I'm asking you, help my unbelief.
Yeah.
So that's what I say to those people, and when you will ask him and find he's enough, he will, and this is what I was praying today in our prayer time, he will take you to deeper levels that you'll never, ever be able to go to unless you go through the storm, unless you go through the fire, because you've never realized, I need a deeper sense of grace and a deeper sense of help. I need a deeper sense of presence. But it's that very storm and pain that made you aware of your deeper need, your more faith. And so you ask for it. He gives it. You just went deeper. And now you know more about the grace of God than you ever did before. And so the next storm you're in, or the next person you're helping, you're not giving an answer you read in a book. You're speaking from experience. Even if you don't tell them your experience, you may or may not, but you can say with confidence, you'll find that God's grace keeps going deeper and deeper. It's limitless. I trust me, you'll find that you cannot go so deep in need or pain that you get to the end of God's grace. And it's like, now what? I got to the end of his help.
Yeah.
Never happened. But there's only one way to really know that, and that is to go there and to find, yes, he is more than enough. Yes, he is faithful. And so that's how I answer that.
And I think that is so, if it's not exactly, it's so close to the heart of what it means to live surrendered.
Yeah.
This is how I have understood my walk with Christ the last 8 years, is I face these difficulties and I understand them to be an opportunity to more deeply surrender. The way that the question has been posed to me in my mind in my walk with Christ has been, okay, Clay, if that does happen, what you're afraid of, if that does happen, am I still good? Am I still enough? And I wrestle with those questions and I say, yes, even then.
Yeah. And the more you go through those, the stronger that yes becomes. Because it's not, I hope so, yes. It's, I know so, because I'm developing a track record. As a 20-something, I'm already developing a track record of God's faithfulness.
Yeah.
And it's not just hearing stories of my parents or in the Bible or people that I admire. I'm getting my own, healthy file of God's faithfulness.
Yes.
Which gives me the confidence to believe for that next thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to continue this Fear Not series. It's going to be a short series, but these pericopes, as we're wrapping up Luke 8, are just so beautiful.
They are. And you got a great one coming up this week.
Yes. So I'm excited for that. But why don't we wrap up there? And so
Good.
if you made it this far, thank you for checking out this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. We love having these conversations. We're praying for you, for anybody who's going to be engaging with this, that God would use these conversations not just to spark curiosity in you about God's word, but especially to bear fruit in your life, which is Christ-likeness, that he would use this to draw you deeper as you're walking this adventure of becoming like Jesus alongside us. So come and join us the next time that we have these conversations, and we'll look forward to it.